From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
President Trump speaks at length with Vladimir Putin, agreeing to open talks on ending the war in Ukraine with no preconditions. We'll have the latest from our national security team as Trump also takes executive action, or says he will, on reciprocal tariffs. We'll have the latest from Evelyn Farkas, executive director of the McCain Institute.
House Republicans take the first step toward extending the Trump tax cuts and raising the debt ceiling by more than $4 trillion. We'll have more with former Republican Senator Pat Toomey, chair of the Senate Banking Committee.
And we'll get his reaction to Fed Chair Jay Powell's second day of testimony on Capitol Hill, where he said the central bank has more work to do after reading today's hot CPI data.
Thanks for joining us on the late edition of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lines. In our nation's capital, President Trump today speaking on separate phone calls with both Russian President Putin and Ukrainian President Zelensky in an attempt to facilitate an end to the war in Ukraine. Here's President Trump this afternoon on where negotiations stand.
I'll be dealing with President Putin largely on the phone, and we ultimately expect to meet. In fact, we expect that he'll come here and I'll go there, and we're going to meet also probably in Saudi Arabia. The first time we'll meet in Saudi Arabia, see if we can get something done. But we want to end that war. That war is a disaster.
Joining us now for more, Bloomberg's Dan Flately reporting with our national security team. Dan, it's great to have you. To the extent that these two ever meet in Saudi Arabia, I realize might still be an open question, but there will be real talks that happen in Munich on Friday.
Yes, absolutely. So, this was not entirely unexpected in the sense that Trump, during the campaign, talked a lot about ending the war in Ukraine. He didn't really talk about how he would do that, but he said he would do it on his first day of in office, or even before that. What I guess is one of the things that's surprising about this is that it took 2 or 3 weeks for this call to come about. But obviously, as you said, Joe, this is an about-face from the approach of the Biden administration, which was basically to not talk to Putin, to not engage with the Russian government on any of these fronts because they didn't want to give up leverage. And so there is some question as to whether not just Trump's comments today in the call with Putin, but also Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's remarks on NATO and Ukraine sort of gave up some of that leverage that the U.S. was sort of working to keep heading into any type of negotiation with Russia. There are some who feel that just the fact that Trump and Putin are talking is not necessarily a bad thing, because at some point you did have to have negotiations if this conflict were to come to an end. But all of this is very, very new in terms of the approach that the U.S. is taking. And I think let's not forget the Treasury Secretary is also in Kyiv working out this deal for critical minerals. So, there's a lot of different things happening.
Well, I'm glad you raised the remarks from Secretary Hegseth, suggesting not just that it's off the table for Ukraine to join NATO, but that U.S. troops won't be involved in any kind of peacekeeping operation. How is that likely to be received by European allies who would, in theory, have to pick up the slack if the U.S. is not willing to offer that support? Yeah,
I don't think it's going to be very well received in Europe. There's no question about that. I think the Europeans generally, as this conflict has played out over the last 3 years, have wanted to present a united front and have really wanted the U.S. to be a leader in that united front because of the size of our economy, the effect that our sanctions have on Russia, but really the effect that our weapons and support have for the Ukrainian military as they are trying to prosecute this war against Russia, to defend this invasion. So I think, this is very alarming for those watching this in Europe. I do think that, one person that I talked to today made the point that Hegseth is sort of saying out loud what everybody sort of had kind of conceded, that Ukraine joining NATO was not going to happen anytime soon and may not ever happen for a lot of different reasons. But again, it's sort of a question of when you're going into a negotiation, you want to have as much leverage on your side of the table as you possibly can have. And so I think that this is a little concerning for some that they're sort of putting this out there already publicly.
All right, Bloomberg's Dan Flately keeping us covered on this story. Thank you so much. And joining us now for more reaction is Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of Arizona State University's McCain Institute, also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine. Evelyn, welcome back to Bloomberg. As we're just discussing this notion of leverage with Dan here, who is coming to these negotiations starting, I guess, just days from now with the strongest hand?
Yeah, I mean, Kayleigh, unfortunately, it looks like we're giving Putin a little bit of a stronger hand than we really should at this point. I would not have advised my Secretary of Defense or any Secretary of Defense to get ahead of negotiations that really are at the presidential level and do so in a way that, again, tends to indicate that we might be already caving into some of Russia's not requests, but demands and preconditions. The most important thing for the United States is to stand by Ukraine's boundaries, Ukraine's right to actually make a decision about a compromise, and then a security guarantee. On that last one, Secretary Hassett was clear, that Ukraine needs a security guarantee, so I was happy to hear that part.
Evelyn, we spoke on the early edition of Balance of Power with Kurt Volker, who I know you know well, the former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. He was also former ambassador to NATO and had this to say about what he believes the Russian president wants right now.
What Putin really wants, and he's been very explicit about it, is to eliminate Ukraine as a sovereign, independent country and eliminate the idea of a Ukrainian national identity. He sees them all as Russians or that he should have control over. Him giving up on that and accepting that Ukraine exists, that is a very, very big deal. And I don't think Ukraine is going to agree that Russia owns Ukrainian territory, has successfully seized it. But I think Zelensky will agree that he's not going to be able to take it back militarily.
If all of that is true, Evelyn, how could Vladimir Putin be taken seriously as a serious actor at the negotiating table?
Well, I mean, he's a serious actor at the negotiating table because he has the power to stop this war immediately. I mean, if he decided that there would be no war, there would be no war. Ukraine has no grievance against Russia. But the Russian president wants to remake the Russian empire, starting with Ukraine, not ending with Ukraine. So if he gets his way in Ukraine, we all need to remember he will turn to Moldova, which is on the border with Romania and other NATO countries. He will turn to Georgia. He will turn to the former Baltic states, which are now NATO members. So it will be a much more dangerous world in Europe. And we can't ignore it because we are part of the NATO alliance. And if Putin does threaten our NATO allies, we will be forced to do something. If we don't, then we will watch him embolden President Xi in China. So we could say, oh, we don't care about Europe, except that President Putin is working hand in glove with President Xi. So you can see that giving Putin any advantage or allowing, somehow the idea that sovereign boundaries don't matter and that Ukraine is not a sovereign state able to make its own decision about political alliances is dangerous to the United States.
Well, Evelyn, as we consider the NATO alliance here, last week we spoke on this program with Lithuania's Foreign Minister Kęstutis Budrys, and this is what he had to say about the importance of at least leaving membership of NATO for Ukraine on the table.
Ukraine's membership, NATO membership, that's the cheapest and fastest way to gain the security guarantees for Ukraine. We all understand that. When we are talking about the guarantees, that's one of the good options to have on the table. And when we are going to the negotiations, there would be unreasonable to take off those options. We have to have those.
So, Evelyn, he described that as the cheapest and fastest way and went on to tell us that there are other ways to guarantee security. They're just costlier and harder. What realistically do those alternative options look like?
Well, I think maybe Foreign Minister Budrys meant, unilateral agreements. But then if it's the United States providing a guarantee to Ukraine, it will cost us more if Russia challenges it. I think any attempt to pull the alliance apart and have individual states guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty and security will cost more for those individual states, but also it's not likely to deter Putin. And then it will be costly indeed, because Putin will attack other states. So the cheapest, quickest way to make sure that Putin does not re-invade Ukraine is allow Ukraine into NATO, because President Putin does not want war with NATO, and he does believe that Article 5, meaning a collective defense of all members of NATO, is credible. He is afraid of NATO. And so if we allow Ukraine in, the threat to Ukraine ends.
Evelyn, I'm looking at President Trump's Truth Social post from earlier when he talked about his telephone call with Volodymyr Zelensky. Earlier, he posted about his call with Vladimir Putin. And he wrote, quote, "We both reflected on the great history of our nations and the fact that we fought so successfully together in World War II, remembering Russia lost tens of millions of people and we likewise lost so many." When you hear him talk about Vladimir Putin and Russia that way, does it not sound like he's already made up his mind?
It sounds like Vladimir Putin gave him a talking point, because that is what the Kremlin talks about all the time when they're trying to get closer to Americans, American people, American politicians. They invoke the memory of World War II when we fought together on one side against the fascists. Well, that was a long time ago, and now Putin is the fascist, and we need to stop him. We need to stop the threat that he's posing to Europe and, frankly, beyond, because of his alliance with President Xi, with the Iranians, and with North Korea.
All right, Evelyn, thank you for being with us, as always. Evelyn Farkas is Executive Director of Arizona State University's McCain Institute and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine. Coming up on Balance of Power, we'll have a look towards Capitol Hill and Republican lawmakers' plans for reconciliation. We have real numbers to talk about. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Thanks for joining us. House Republicans out with a blueprint today at last that looks to accomplish President Trump's top legislative priorities all in one bill. This has been weeks, if not months, in the making. And Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has details from the White House. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. This is one of the first real concrete steps that we've seen from House Republicans as they try to accomplish President Trump's fiscal agenda. This plan would look to implement tax cuts, but also likely slash spending for some programs such as Medicaid, and would raise the debt limit. But as you mentioned there, this has been months in the making for House Republicans and likely faces a rocky road ahead, particularly as the Senate moves forward with their two-bill plan. Now, you had the chance to catch up with Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He's the former director of the Congressional Budget Office, and he said that things could get complicated from here, but at this point, all this White House wants is to get it done.
There are no style points in reconciliation. You got to get to 51 in the Senate. You're going to have to get to 217 in the House. They have no margin for error, so they're going to add and subtract until they can get to yes. That may look like one big bill, maybe two in the end. It's the domestic policy agenda that's really what the president should care about. How many little pieces it comes in is not really too important.
So here's what's inside the plan. It calls for a minimum of $1.5 trillion in spending cuts over 10 years to programs such as Medicaid and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program known as SNAP. That's below what some conservative fiscal hawks wanted to see. It also allows the Ways and Means Committee to pursue $4.5 trillion in tax cuts over a decade, and also raises the debt ceiling by $4 trillion. Now, as the math shakes out, this plan would likely only extend President Trump's 2017 tax cuts. Joan Kelly, that could mean some other tax cut priorities that President Trump campaigned on, including no taxes on tips, Social Security, or overtime pay, could be left on the table if House Republicans can't find some pay-fors to supplement them.
Well, and Tyler, we know the president does want all of those things to get done. He also wants these things done as soon as possible. So what's the realistic timeline we're looking at?
Right. So, Kayleigh, House Speaker Mike Johnson has said that he would like to see this get moving this month. He says that he's going to be meeting with his members for the rest of this week. And part of why he pursued this one bill strategy is because this is a House conference that often doesn't agree on a lot of things. Just look at the speakership battle that Mike Johnson went through. That was really over this idea of spending cuts. So we're going to be watching some of those same members that brought up concerns during that cycle, such as Chip Roy, and what they are saying about what they need to see done for the fiscal deficit in order to move this bill forward. But it's important to note that these are razor thin margins. Mike Johnson can really only afford to lose one vote in order to make this doable.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House for us this evening. Thank you. Now, Fed Chair Jay Powell was back on Capitol Hill today, this time before the House Financial Services Committee, where he responded to today's hot inflation data.
So the best thing we can do for Americans is to vigorously pursue both stable prices and maximum employment. We're trying to get back to a long expansion where prices are stable around 2%.
Joining us now for more is Stuart Paul of Bloomberg Economics. So, Stuart, we know about the dual mandate. The question is what rate is appropriate to achieve it. Did we get any indication from the chairman that more rate cuts are coming soon?
Nothing coming soon. If anything, we got a little bit of evidence that the Fed is comfortable remaining on a prolonged pause. Fed Chairman Powell stayed mum when it comes to the inflation consequences of tariffs. Whenever the question came up, and it did come up multiple times, he mentioned that it's the totality of executive branch policy and congressional policy, legislation, that the Fed is going to be taking into consideration when it considers its policy response to policy changes coming out of the Congress and coming out of the executive branch. For the policy wonks that I know are watching, there were two items that I think were most interesting. Fed Chair Powell basically insinuated that having a particular or a specific vice chair for supervision can add additional volatility that's unnecessary, economic volatility, policy volatility. And as vice chairman for supervision, Barr's term is coming to an end as his resignation comes up just in March. That's an interesting little tidbit that did come from this hearing. Beyond that, he emphasized once again that the Fed can continue running down its balance sheet, continuing with its quantitative tightening process. We had been expecting an end to that balance sheet normalization process early in the spring. So those are two little policy-related tidbits that folks can chew on while the Fed remains on pause in the context of interest rates.
So a little bit of news today. There's also, of course, the push and pull between Donald Trump and Jay Powell. The Fed chair did stress the importance today, Stuart, of an independent central bank. Here's what he said.
You know, research over many, many years in many, many jurisdictions shows that some degree of independence is very important in keeping inflation under control. And the connection is obvious. If politicians are going to want to be reelected and things like that, they're not going to be focused on the longer term. We have the mandate to remain separate from all of that.
Stuart, how did he do with all the questions about independence and the Trump effect?
He did a good job. I think that it was easy, actually, to do a good job today because President Trump was out early requesting rate cuts. And then we got this blowout CPI number, which really just emphasizes the point that Powell was making without him even needing to harp on it all too much. There is really no such thing as a free lunch in economics, but if there's one thing that's close, it's an independent central bank that promises a bit more economic stability, a bit more stable inflation, and a little bit more growth. So Powell, fortunately, didn't have to emphasize that point too much. The CPI data did the work for him.
Stuart, it's great to have you back. On day two of Jay Powell's testimony, Stuart Paul, Bloomberg Economics, we thank you. Donald Trump posting on Truth Social, interest rates should be lowered. He writes something which would go hand in hand with upcoming tariffs. Let's rock and roll, America. 3 exclamation points. Yes, Jay Powell is a Grateful Dead fan. Coming up, Bloomberg's conversation with Kevin Hassett, director of the National Economic Council. Following today's CPI data, he spoke with us earlier today on Bloomberg TV and radio. That's next on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Earlier today, Kevin Hassett, director of the National Economic Council, joined Bloomberg to discuss today's hot consumer price inflation data and discuss the Trump administration's plan for getting that down. But the conversation started with whether the administration would be willing to slow economic growth to hold prices level.
We're absolutely not willing to slow down economic growth, and we will not. In fact, President Trump is telling everybody that we're going to have a golden age, and we're hatching a plan to do that. But the bottom line is that, as you know, you just talked about the CPI, that the economy that we inherited from President Biden keeps looking worse and worse, so that their jobs record was revised down by 1 million jobs just a week ago. And now we're seeing that core inflation and top line inflation are really, really above the Fed's target in the latest report, which is really the last report for the Biden administration. The Trump administration has a really aggressive plan to fix the disaster that the Biden economy became. And in fact, if we go back and look, that right now it's the case that Americans are still paying something like $1,200 a month less or more for the same amount of stuff because of this inflation. And egg prices are up 100% in the Biden administration and so on. So there's a lot of work to do. But the way you get inflation down is you do micro things. And we can talk about those micro policies, like how do we address the avian flu? We're all over it. But then you do macro things, too. And the macro things are to get aggregate demand, all that massive government spending, $1.5 trillion a year more than we thought it would be this year, back when we looked ahead in 2019. So you got to get that spending down, and then you got to have more supply side policies like deregulation, drilling, and tax cuts.
Well, let's talk a bit more about inflation and how you plan to address it, because a lot of people looking at these numbers are saying this doesn't even factor in the impact of tariffs here, tariffs that have just been put in place, but also potential tariffs to come. So how do you plan the administration to actually lower prices if these tariff policies come through?
Again, in the end, inflation is very much a macroeconomic phenomenon, and it depends on balancing supply and demand. And you guys might recall that when the big runaway stimulus bill that the Democrats passed was first passed, that even before inflation began, my friend John Cochran and I out at Hoover wrote an article at National Review, and we were talking on TV about how this is probably going to be about 7% inflation that year. And so it's not rocket science. It's not really hard to calculate what happens. What you have to do is have a lot of supply and reduce demand. And if you do that, prices go down. And so a big positive supply shock with more constrained government spending is going to fix the problem.
You can find our full conversation with Kevin Hassett, director of the National Economic Council, inside the White House, online or on the terminal. Really interesting, Kayleigh, to hear the nuances of this conversation as the administration rejects this idea of tying tariffs and inflation together.
Yeah, and of course, the ideas around tariffs themselves are still coming fully into form, as we still have questions at this hour as to whether or not we could get an announcement from this White House on reciprocal tariffs that Donald Trump suggested he could sign tomorrow.
He said Tuesday or Wednesday.
Initially, yes.
Then said he could do it right now or maybe tomorrow. We'll find out as this goes. Maybe there's a negotiation underway tonight. Coming up, we'll have a look at the Republicans' budget battle. Pat Toomey, the former senator from Pennsylvania, is with us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
All I can tell my House colleagues, whatever you need to do to get the one beautiful bill, do it. Do it now. You have my blessing, you have my support. But if we can't do it quickly, we need to go to Plan B.
Republican Senator Lindsey Graham on his plan to move forward with a two-track budget plan. We'll say two beautiful bills, despite the House's efforts to pass its own budget reconciliation bill. They're both starting to mark these up at the same time. It's kind of a question of who might finish first. And joining us now is someone who's been there, former U.S. Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. Senator, great to see you. Welcome back, as always. I'm thinking about the saucer and the cup here, the upper chamber versus the lower chamber. Is the Senate going to save the day? Lindsey Graham is standing by with Plan B.
Well, I think Senator Graham is exactly right. If you could do this, if you can do this all in one big, beautiful bill, then that obviously eliminates the risk that something gets left behind that you're unable to do later, right? So just from a tactical point of view, it would be great for Republicans if they can put all the essential pieces in one place. But the question is, can that pass, right? Can that hold every Republican in the House, which you pretty much need to do? Can that get you 50 Republican votes in the Senate? I think the strategy should be go ahead and try. The House should go ahead and proceed. And if it can continue successfully moving down that path and holding all the Republicans in the House, then you probably will have 50 Republicans in the Senate as well. But at some point, if it collapses or it gets bogged down and you just can't move that House bill because you don't have the votes, then you're going to have to go to Plan B, which is what Lindsey Graham is prepared to do.
Well, and what it will take to get the requisite votes in the House, sir, it seems, is you have to get the hardliners on board with what they deem to be appropriate levels of spending cuts. The plan that was outlined today, $4.5 trillion given to Ways and Means to cut taxes, but you have to have at least $1.5 trillion to cut spending. And if you want the additional tax cuts Trump is looking for, no tax on tips, on overtime, on Social Security, you're going to have to find ways to pay for them. If they're already tapping into Medicaid, to SNAP, what existing ways that are politically palatable are there going to be left over?
Well, yeah, it's going to be challenging. They absolutely have to look at Medicaid. I mean, keep in mind, both Barack Obama and Joe Biden dramatically expanded Medicaid. And I don't know why Republicans couldn't support the idea of let's go back to the way it was before the most recent, very liberal Democratic administration expanded it dramatically, right? It's not like those provisions have been around for decades. They've been around for a couple of years. So that's certainly, and that's a huge program. There are huge opportunities there. They're going to have to go after the big category of non-defense discretionary spending. They really should look at whether there are fraudulent payments going out to, in the case of Social Security, to people who are deceased, to people who are not eligible, that sort of thing. But you're right. Look, it's a challenge to do both the extension of the existing tax policy, which, let's keep in mind, that's not new tax cuts. That's extending current policy. And I think that the various provisions that President Trump suggested along the campaign trail, I hope they're considered sort of menu items, and Congress can consider them as they will. Most of them are not very pro-growth. The most important thing is to extend the otherwise expiring provisions of the 2017 tax reform.
Well, we'll see about all of that. Of course, you add tariffs to the conversation. Senator, things start to get interesting. We spoke with Republican Congressman Jason Smith, who chairs the House Ways and Means Committee, about this, talked about the impact tariffs would have in the budget bill's CBO score. Listen to how he talked about the potential to raise revenue here.
When you care about the fiscal health of the nation as a whole, you have to look at the possible influx of future revenues that could come from the president's trade proposals. And across the board, 10% tariff, which the president did campaign on, an across-the-board tariff, that can bring in trillions of dollars. So those are things that you have to look at that can affect the fiscal health of the nation as a whole. But in the rules of reconciliation, CBO and joint tax will not allow those to be scored appropriately.
Pat Toomey, you could weigh in on the scoring all you want, but I'm pretty sure you came into the Republican Party when the word tariff was still a swear word for the GOP. Yeah. Is he right about this windfall of raising trillions of dollars?
No, it's never going to get to trillions of dollars, but it will do serious damage. If you impose across the board tariffs, as the president has sometimes threatened, what you certainly do is you raise the price level, so all Americans have to pay more for everything that's imported. That lowers the standard of living of Americans who now have less money to go around because they have to pay more of this tax. It makes American manufacturers less competitive because the huge numbers, the majority of American manufacturers depend to some degree on imported components. Those prices go up. They become less competitive. We saw this every time it's been tried, frankly, but most recently when the president imposed steel and aluminum tariffs in his first term, it killed far more jobs than it created because there are far more jobs in the manufacturing jobs that use steel as a component. And when you raise the cost of that by imposing these tariffs, you make those manufacturers less competitive. So, like I said, it's going to immediately raise prices, lower the standard of living of Americans.
So then what are we in for, sir, considering that 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum are going to in effect at the beginning of next month? And it's not just that, but it's finished products as well.
Well, so that is the current threat. Of course, we were also told that there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. They were all going to go into effect. And then the market sold off badly, if you recall, early last week after the weekend announcement about the tariffs. And President Trump backtracked quite a bit. So I don't think we really know where this all ends up. But the more the president uses tariffs, and by the way, it'd be great to see Congress reassert its actual constitutional responsibility here. It is Congress's responsibility to determine tariff levels, and they really should claim this back from the president. But be that as it may, to the extent that the president uses tariffs, it's going to weaken our economy, and revenue numbers will be a real problem.
Somehow we haven't mentioned the name Elon Musk in this conversation. I don't think we have, Kayleigh, which is saying a lot about so much else to talk about. Senator, does Congress also need to sign off on the pretty incredible levels of spending cuts that we've seen, spending freezes, maybe I should say, that are coming out of the DOGE, not to mention some of the other suggestions of just shuttering entire federal agencies?
Yeah, I think the answer is in many cases, yes, but not necessarily in all cases. Unfortunately, one of the other things that Congress has gotten badly wrong is giving just too much discretion to the presidents for decades and increasingly lately. And so if the statute that authorizes the payment grants the president a lot of discretion in whether or not and how to spend it, then the president might very well be within the law to cut back on some of that. Some of the spending that they are looking at might be occurring in a way that contravenes the law in the first place. So that certainly shouldn't be continued. But fundamentally, the vast majority of the spending has to be approved or rejected by Congress. I hope they cut it dramatically. We've been overspending massively for years now. It's gotten much, much worse in recent years. Even this fiscal year that we're 4 months into, spending is 15% higher. 15% higher by the federal government than it was for the same period last year. So I'm very much in favor of Elon Musk finding everything he can. A lot of it is going to finally need Congress's approval.
All right, Pat Toomey, former Republican senator from Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining. And we'll continue this conversation coming up on tariffs and the Trump administration's other efforts with our political panel. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Are you planning to sign an executive order on reciprocal tariffs, sir?
Yes, I am. In fact, I may do it today, and if I do it today, I could almost do it right now. We'll be signing reciprocal tariffs. The world has taken advantage of the United States for many years. They've charged us massive tariffs that we haven't charged them. And as you know, I just did something on steel and aluminum, 25%. And that'll go up at some point, but 25%, which will level the playing field quite a bit.
President Trump a short time ago in the Oval Office teasing the idea of signing an executive order focused on reciprocal tariffs. He said that would happen yesterday or today, and it still hasn't. This comes as the president swore in Tulsi Gabbard as the newly confirmed director of national intelligence, all in the same event. Joining us now this evening's political panel, Kevin Walling, Democratic strategist and vice president of HG Creative, alongside Lisa Camuso-Miller, Republican strategist, host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Great to see you both here. I have to just lay down a marker right now and remind everybody you predicted this would happen. We were told repeatedly by how many guests, Kayleigh, that Tulsi Gabbard could not get the votes, that Republicans would not line up behind her. And here we are today watching her being sworn in. How did she do it? How did Donald Trump do it?
I think that a lot of it has to do with momentum, right? The momentum was behind her. As much as there were a lot of questions in the minds of those that were having to make the choice about whether or not to confirm her, I think momentum is on the side of the White House in that he said that he wanted this to happen. They saw some red flags. They still had some questions about her overall. But I think ultimately what happened is the U.S. Senate said, let's give the president his pick and see how this goes.
Could this have gone any differently if Democrats had handled it any differently? Was the pushback not intense enough, Kevin, or there was just simply nothing they could do to stop this train once it was rolling?
I think that's the case. I mean, we've got 53 Republican votes. And the most interesting thing to come out of all of this is the freedom that Mitch McConnell seems to be exercising. The former Republican leader, the caucus leader, the longest Republican leader in Senate history, is the only one really standing against some of these nominees. But you saw major objections by James Lankford, right, Republican of Oklahoma, Susan Collins, others in that Senate Intelligence Committee hearing with Tulsi Gabbard. That kind of went by the wayside, to Lisa's point, with that pressure campaign by the president, by the White House, by outside influencers. You saw Meghan McCain. You saw others up there on the Hill, in that kind of Republican conservative ecosystem, surround her and support her and push her through.
We can assume RFK Jr. has the votes on the floor as well?
Well, he passed that one of the major hurdles today with 53 Republican votes. And it's likely that that's going to be the case as well.
So he gets the whole team, I guess, with the exception of Matt Gaetz, who really never got out of the blocks to begin with.
Well, and potentially Kash Patel, too, obviously, with the situation with Chairman Grassley. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it's an excellent point that you have Kash Patel, you still have Howard Lutnick, many others who still have to get fully through this confirmation process. And the likes of Howard Lutnick are presumably playing a role in policy that is already being, at the very least, outlined, if not solidified, as we're hearing the president today talking about reciprocal tariffs. First, it was going to be yesterday or today. Now it seems we could get them tomorrow. Very unclear on timeline. And I wonder, Lisa, how you view the kind of rollout we have seen with, frankly, all of these tariff policies, keeping us guessing, will he, won't he, when will he?
It's really hard to tell. And honestly, we're living a lifetime every single day with every single announcement that is coming out fast and furious. It's clear he's not waiting for his nominees to be put in place. He doesn't need the Commerce Secretary's approval to get these tariffs put in place, obviously. So that's the kind of thing. And also, too, Lutnick has been an advisor and a counsel to the president for a long time before he even was reelected. So I suspect that they've had these conversations, and these are things that are in concert with what they've discussed. The president, it's hard to know what the strategy is behind this, other than let's get some things moving. The difficulty here now is that with all of these tariffs, reciprocal tariffs, all of the other things that he's talking about, the president runs a risk of falling back on a campaign promise that he had, and that was to reduce the prices for the American people in terms of things that really matter to them. But I've got to tell you, I've had more conversations with people outside the Beltway that are not at all concerned. They are absolutely delighted with the fact that the president is moving as quickly as he is. And that's the kind of thing that I think we're going to see more and more of, is that he's not taking cues from the way things have been done in the past. He's going to do things his way, and that's precisely what he promised.
Does he sound like someone who wants to implement reciprocal tariffs, talking today about, well, I could do it right now if I wanted to, maybe I'll wait for tomorrow? Or is this someone waiting to exact concessions from any number of trade partners so he does not have to enact them?
Joe, this sounds like the television producer that he is. I mean, he's teasing this for all of us to talk about it because he is the center of this debate. He's the center of this attention. Sure. It's for maximum pressure on both adversaries and allies. And he wants it to be the Trump show, which it is.
Pat Toomey, though, a former Republican senator, holding his nose at the idea of tariffs here, what that would mean for steel in his state, for instance. This could get very complicated for conservatives.
I mean, that, Joe, was a really fascinating conversation that the both of you had with the former senator, where he said this should maybe come back to be more of the purview of the United States Senate, of the Congress, and the fact that, we've seen so much accumulation of presidential power at the detriment of Congress in the last number of decades.
Well, and when we consider tariffs specifically here, and this idea that he's using it as leverage to extract concessions, does that at any point, Lisa, become a boy who cried wolf scenario? And if he doesn't do all of the things he's threatened to do enough times, people are going to be like, okay, well, this isn't actually going to happen. We don't need to give you what you want.
Kayleigh, you make a great point, and ordinarily the answer is yes. But this is a president who has done this over and over again to his great success. I mean, we saw what happened last week with Mexico and with Canada. Was it last week? I've lost all track of time. But what I'm saying is that but this kind of movement, this kind of gesture that he makes is the kind of gesture that really does cause other adversaries and allies and trade partners make decisions quickly. So other than what we've traditionally seen, I do think that this is working in his favor, and so it sounds like that's what he's doing.
Trade war with Colombia.
I think it was 2 weeks ago
right.
trade war with Colombia didn't last very long. Last week, Canada and Mexico. This Monday was steel and aluminum.
Yeah, we'll see what the
Feels
rest of
it's
today
been a
brings.
year.
How about
yeah, Kevin Walling and Lisa Camuso-Miller will be sticking with us as we look at the House Oversight Committee's hearing on the DOGE. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I believe enslaving our nation in debt is one of the biggest betrayals against the American people by its own elected government.
Do you know how much money a day Mr. Musk will receive from the federal government for his contracts?
No.
The answer is $8 million a day.
When people squeal and don't ask questions, I think it shows the American public what the heck's going on. And that little gravy train is getting ready to run out.
Mr. Elon Musk, if you would like to appear in front of the Oversight Committee, you have been duly invited. Please, come tell us what you're doing, come testify in front of the American people, and please come hold yourself to account.
Highlights from the first DOGE subcommittee hearing in the House today, chaired by Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. That was one of the voices you heard. I think you can distinguish which ones were the Democrats and the Republicans speaking. And back with us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio, our political panel this evening, Kevin Walling and Lisa Camuso-Miller. So you're starting, Kevin, to see the congressional arm of DOGE, if you will, if that really even exists, begin to work. But what role are they really going to play, given the intensity with which Elon Musk is already moving through this government?
Yeah, clearly not much of one. When it was announced by Republican leadership that Marjorie Taylor Greene was going to chair this subcommittee, you can see the credence behind, the attention that Congress would have in this department. This is clearly an entire operation run by the second article of the Constitution, the executive branch here, with very little oversight. Marjorie Taylor Greene, others have given carte blanche to Elon Musk, seemingly, to do this. The only real check on all this has been the judiciary, Article 3, in terms of actual oversight, halting some of these operations that we've seen.
Just imagine hearing that highlight reel or seeing it a year ago and trying to figure out what everyone was talking about. That just perfectly encapsulates the conversation right now in Washington. Is Kevin right? Does Congress play any role in this? Is Marjorie Taylor Greene talking to herself?
No,
Elon Musk actually
I couldn't agree more with my Democratic counterpart on this one. I mean, they said they were going to put Marjorie Taylor Greene in charge of it, and that's about as serious as they're going to take it, because she's the kind of person who's going to tout the line. She's going to talk about how important it is, and then they're going to let the Democrats have their place to complain about how unhappy they are about the way it's going to go, and it's going to probably look a lot like that for the next year that we hear from them.
Okay, but what about what Kevin said on Article 3 and the way in which the judicial branch is really the one who seems to be holding them to account right now, to the extent to which Elon Musk is now suggesting impeaching judges who are ruling against DOGE? What does that say about where we are?
Well, I think I'm not the first person to say this, but this is where we are in the Constitution and how the constitutional crisis really is sort of presenting itself. Because now the question becomes whether or not the administration takes the court's recommendations seriously and what that does, and if they even follow the rule of the law.
Elon on X, bravo, Kevin. He writes, we must impeach judges who are grossly undermining the will of the people and destroying America. It is the only way. Is this a constitutional crisis?
I mean, I would argue that we are in one, especially if, we all disagree oftentimes with what judges and justices do, especially if you're involved in politics. But in a country with the rule of law, we abide by those decisions, going back to Marbury versus Madison and the whole idea of judicial review. This harkens back to, President Andrew Jackson, right, when the Supreme Court ruled against him. And he said, the Supreme Court ruled, now see if they can enforce it. And that was a real crisis back then. And to think that we are now back in those times where, 200 years later, we're about to celebrate 250 years of this experiment, that we would so harken back to those days where you would even question the legitimacy of the third article of government and the third branch of government. It's horrifying.
Upon facing questions around this in the Oval Office yesterday, though, the president did say, we should note, I always abide by the courts. He seemed to indicate he will be standing by what the rulings are. Kevin, do you believe that?
I would hope so, and I think he has every reason to believe in that, too, because he now has installed 3 of those justices on the Supreme Court. He often praises that court when he gets it right in his favor. But this is, he loves, to have a straw man argument, and oftentimes the court has that. It's what fueled his rise back to the presidency again, railing against DAs in the court system.
He did say that he'd abide by the courts, you're right, Kayleigh, but that he would also continue to appeal them. Do these just stay balled up in courts for the coming months or years? He doesn't actually have to implement anything?
Yes, it feels that way. It really does. I mean, if you look at the behavior of the courts and the way we've had all of these other court cases unfold, it looks to be that that's probably the way that's going to go. But I guess it remains to be seen. It'd be great to see some of the power of the court actually come back online. The same is true of the Congress. What has happened, really, is we have a very, very strong administration right now, and everyone else seems to not be quite as strong as that. And that, to me, is where that balance of power has really gone out of whack, and that's where we come to that constitutional crisis.
A great conversation with Lisa Camuso-Miller and Kevin Walling, a great panel. We thank you both for your insights. A lot to catch up on this evening. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
And we'll see you back here tomorrow. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.